The story about Jesus' encounter with John the Baptist is portrayed a little differently in each of the four gospel writings in the New Testament. In the gospel according to Mark, which we have today, which is in fact pretty much the beginning of the gospel according to Mark, there's the basic story of the baptism of Jesus' experience. John comes as a prophet, is dressed like a prophet, and proclaims the coming of the Messiah, and then Jesus comes. Not really related to that. John doesn't point him out or anything, and Jesus is baptized. I've always had a sense in reading that the descent of the dove, the coming of the Spirit, the voice from heaven was a personal experience of Mark's. There's not an indication that John really is involved in it or the people around. And Matthew follows Mark pretty much, but he does add an interchange between John and Jesus, where John protests that really he's the one that should be baptized by Jesus. And that indicates to me that he has a sense that this is the one. And Jesus says, no, they should follow along with the proper form of things for the time being, and Jesus is baptized. But even though it doesn't exactly say it, I've had a sense that John shares in the witnessing of the descent of the Spirit and may have heard the voice as well. Luke adds a lot of context by identifying John as the cousin of Jesus. He has a whole lead-in to the story of the baptism where Mary, before Jesus' birth, goes to her cousin Elizabeth, who is miraculously with child in her old age, and on entering, the child in Elizabeth's womb leaps for joy at the presence of the Lord. So there's this communication between the two babies in the womb. It's pretty elaborate. And then Luke goes on to pretty much follow the line of Matthew and Mark. The fourth gospel, the gospel according to John, is in many ways quite different, as it is throughout that particular writing. John the Baptist here is treated almost like a competitor to Jesus, or at least an alternative that should not be followed, as if there were people following. John makes a point, even in the prologue that we heard for the gospel last week, and we heard on Christmas Eve, where in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There's a couple of places where it's pointedly pointed out, almost to the detriment of the flow of the prologue, that John was not the one to come, that he was not the light, that the true light was coming into the world. So it's almost like he's protesting against people who thought John was the one to come, who thought John might be the light. And John, the fourth gospel tells about how some of John's disciples came to be Jesus' disciples. John, in fact, does not depict Jesus really ever being baptized. John the Baptist recognizes him and calls him the Lamb of God, and that's it. And the difference is I think, in these four tellings of the baptism story, which is the theme for the first Sunday after Epiphany, mark different ways that the writers are presenting Jesus. For Mark and Matthew, I think, the primary image that they're trying to get across is the image of the Messiah within the Jewish spiritual tradition of expectation. That's why Matthew has this clearly, intently prophetic description of John the Baptist. And then Luke and John, the fourth gospel, I think emphasize really, in some way or another, the growing sense of the divinity of Jesus and his spiritual power, which really is intended, I think, to appeal more to a Greek audience than Greek and Roman audience than it is to a Jewish kind of spirituality. For Mark, Jesus' messiahship was on a need-to-know basis. He has, as a theme, what's been identified by biblical scholars as the messianic secret. His normal life is only understood as the redemptive act of God through the ongoing community to which Mark is writing. It's not foreseen by John the Baptist in this telling. It's not recognized really in Jesus' lifetime beyond the small circle of the apostles. And in Mark's gospel, the apostles really are kind of doofuses. They keep not getting it. So maybe they didn't even understand. Matthew portrays Jesus as the Messiah, but has a little different spin on the nature of the Messiah. He paints Jesus as the new Moses. Jesus gives the new law in the Sermon on the Mount as Moses gave the law on Sinai. And this Mosaic image of the Messiah comes through, which was new, I think, in messianic spirituality. Luke paints Jesus as a wonder worker. Many healings, many miracles, showing a kind of spiritual power that was very impressive. And the fourth gospel goes even further. The reason why the gospel according to John, the writer of the gospel according to John, doesn't show Jesus being baptized, and why Luke and Matthew actually are uncomfortable with it, is that baptism was a ritual designed for the forgiveness of sins. And as the divinity of Jesus is proclaimed more, there's less and less comfort with the acknowledgement that he had any sin touch his life. And so you see an evolution in some ways from a messianic to incarnational spirituality. It's in the fourth gospel that the Word becomes flesh. And that really is only worked out fully through the development of our creeds. And all these different ways of saying, as I mentioned, I think last week, or I tried to mention, are to get across an inner truth in a way that people could understand. They spoke in the images that people came to them with, and they found ways of speaking and used a language that made sense to them and translated this key, ineffable experience into something that could be passed along. But the central point that seems common to all of these ways of explaining it, whether Jewish or Greek, is that the life of Jesus, in the life of Jesus, God, the source of all reality, has come to human beings. Eternity has come into time. Heaven has touched the earth. Spirit and matter are joined. Timeless truth has been expressed in history. And through the life of Jesus, they and we have access to God, to the source of all reality, a way to experience eternity, a blissful sense of the presence of heaven, a renewed life in the power of the Spirit, and an awareness of timeless truth in a way that we didn't have before. As I said last week, this Christmas gift, this Epiphany means a showing forth, and throughout the season after Epiphany, we have stories of Jesus showing forth this grace. These Epiphanies are meant to be understood, whether they're understood in a Jewish context as the coming of the Messiah, whether they're understood in a Greek context as the incarnation of the Logos of God, or whether they're understood in some other way that makes more sense to us, carry that deep experience of ultimate reality and ultimate truth and grace. If the whole range of traditional Christian expression, the scriptures, the creeds, the rituals, the moral codes, the institutions as they've been evolved through a tradition of faithful people, intelligent people who've passed these on, if those things work for you, then well and good. Just make sure that they still are connecting you with God, with ultimate reality, rather than becoming kind of ends in themselves and really distracting you from that meaningful relationship in the world, or blocking it. Sometimes they can become idolatrous. And be sure that the energy of that relationship, gained in that way, that deep meaning of your life that comes in that relationship, can flow back into your life in the everyday world, rather than being an escape from the everyday world. That's important. So, I mean, and it's not that hard to figure out if this is working. Paul says elsewhere that you can know if this is all working for you by noticing what he calls the fruits of the Spirit in your life. Is your life one of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control? Or at least, is that the direction in which your faith seems to be leading you? And if not, you need to look at the tradition deeper, or you need to find some other way to make that happen. I mean, we can recommend, I think, our tradition, our scriptures, our creeds, our rituals, our moral codes, our institutions as a way into such a life. But we can do that without being rigidly demanding that this is understood as the only way. God is bigger than that. The wise men, after all, weren't Jewish. They didn't become Jewish. They didn't become Christian. They were Babylonian and or Persian astrologers. The star that they followed was not for them, at least, some fulfillment of a biblical prophecy, nor was it some astronomical anomaly that we might, in our kind of modern, arrogant, we know everything science, think, oh, well, that's what really happened. The star they followed was an astrological sign that meant something to them and drew them. The baptism of John wasn't a Christian baptism. We hear about that in the epistle today. And what you make of that experience of being baptized in the Spirit is, interesting thing to explore too. I'm open to all kinds of epiphanies, to showing forths of God, wherever and however they may be made manifest in the church and its tradition, but lots of other places as well. That's why I think that opening of the book of Genesis is read today. All of it comes from God. The point is that God is reaching out in all this that we do and in all that there is. And we read and talk and think about what happened for them and him back there, because through them and through him, right here, right now, that can happen for us. I pray, I hope, I believe. We are God's beloved children. And with us, he is well pleased. Thanks be to God.